question in writing, and now we turn to the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes, Mr. Loudermilk.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate everyone being here. It's interesting that the Bank Security Act was brought up earlier, which I don't necessarily disagree with the sentiment. I just don't know that the Bank Security Act is the place to report real estate purchases. However, I believe the Bank Security Act needs to be revised because we're dealing with reporting thresholds that were developed in the 1970s at $10,000 to where it should be around $65,000 to $70,000 today. One of the reasons that I think it's important for us to update those is because at these low thresholds, the government is forcing financial institutions to report significant information to the government, of which the government is holding information about individual citizens and businesses that they're not utilizing. When I was in the intelligence arena in the Air Force, we had one principle, which was if you don't need something, don't keep it, because you don't have to protect what you don't have. I know that the United States is a huge target for cyber crimes and for data breaches. And even U.S. law enforcement agencies have repeatedly called China the most significant state actor threat to our country in cyberspace, which we know the government would be a target. Now, I bring up the Bank Security Act because while we're trying to reform that so the government isn't keeping a lot of PII on citizens that could be breached to a foreign actor, U.S. regulators are implementing a consolidated audit trail, which would also capture a lot of information and does capture information about investors. And so, Mr. Lorber, some of the information that, and we've worked to kind of minimize some of the information that is collected by the Consolidated Audit Trail, but under the current iteration, the Consolidated Audit Trail, the customer accounts and information systems would include names, addresses, and date of birth for most U.S. investors. What risk would this information pose to U.S. investors if a foreign adversary, specifically the Chinese, were to gain that information?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a good question. I'm not specifically familiar with the Consolidated Information Audit Trail that you're mentioning. However, I will say that any situation in which there is consolidated personal information about individuals, there is a risk that if that information is secured or captured or breached, that it could be, used to develop information that could, used to compromise those persons or otherwise exploit information about them.
Yeah. Mr. Willem, do you have any thoughts on the Consolidated Audit Trail or the information, if it was divulged to China, that could be used against U.S. citizens or our economic stability?
I think you're right to ask questions about it, but it's not my specific area of expertise.
Okay. Well, let me move on for another area of this. And there, as I said, there's been some progress of limiting the types of PIA in the Consolidated Audit Trail. For anybody, what type of retention policy do you believe would be appropriate to prevent any information, whether it's from Consolidated Audit Trail, tax return information, what type of data retention policy do you believe would be appropriate to prevent information from falling into China or any foreign adversary? Anybody? I think this illustrates that we've got some areas that we're still not really thinking about because a lot of times we're focused on China as China versus the United States government, when in reality it's China versus the individual citizen of the United States as well. And so I think this is something that we need to invest time and effort looking into as far as protecting data and information from cyber actors. And part of that, and I'll conclude with this, that I've said all along, the government is our biggest security risk because it is mandating massive amounts of data to be collected from financial institutions, from individuals, that is not used by the government. I mean, when you look at the currency transaction reports, over 90% of them are never looked at. I would imagine this a near same statistic on the other reports that have to come in, suspicious activity reports. If we're not using the data, why are we collecting it, why are we keeping it, why are we mandating other institutions to provide it? With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.